Well, quite rightly, this is a very lively room because there's no joy in heaven like when one lamb returns to the fold. So welcome back, Paul, to the Bank of England. It gives me great pleasure to introduce this session. It promises to be a fascinating hour. Paul's going to discuss his new book, Unelected Power, The Quest for Legitimacy in Central Banking and the Regulatory State. And for many of you, many in this room, Paul needs no introduction. But for those, some of you here and for those watching live stream across the bank, actually he does, because about half of the bank has joined since you left. So whether you're an old colleague or a new joiner, we're all in for a treat, because Paul's shortly going to give us some of the benefit of his vast and varied experience in central banking. And I think before he does, I want to just first acknowledge the debt of gratitude that all of us owe Paul, those of us in the Bank of England, in broader central banking, in the financial services, in the broader economy, for his decades of service to this institution, to the people of the United Kingdom and beyond, including his very significant role in shaping the response of both the Bank of England and the broader central banking community to the financial crisis. In the depths of the crisis, Paul led the work to design and implement a series of innovative schemes to address the severe liquidity crunch. In its aftermath, he was there at the center. In fact, he was there at the conception of the Financial Stability Board and at the center of its steering committee, which assembled the key blocks of the G20's reform program. He served as chair of the Resolution Steering Group and also the Committee for Payment and Settlement Systems, which has been snappily renamed now as the Committee for, well, CPMI, Committee for...
That's snappy too, isn't it?
That's snappy. What is it? Payments and Markets Infrastructure. Yeah. I've got the tattoo. I just couldn't remember what it meant. He led, but in those roles, particularly with the key attributes, led efforts that we are now implementing to end too big to fail, to overhaul OTC derivative markets and the associated financial market infrastructure, amongst much, much else. And of course, here at the bank, helped conceive, implement our macroprudential committee, some of whose members are here, the FPC, and as the interim committee took some of its toughest decisions in its lifetime. And in all of those activities, he would have touched on some of the core issues he's considered in his book. He's clearly been thinking about these issues for some time. It reported to me that he used to play Fantasy Bank of England. Fantasy Bank of England with Matt Hancock. God, that's a rich vein too. But I'm not. It's a game. I did spot it. Yes.
That's why you have the structure that you have, for those of you that work here.
Yeah, that's right. Nothing escapes our attention. It's all in the archives. But now, drawing on that experience, and I just lightly touched on his experience as a central banker, but also reflecting at his time as a senior fellow at Harvard and other roles, he's brought together some views on the role of powerful technocratic bodies in democratic societies. So not just about central banking, much broader. This is a serious academic work that's enhanced by much practical knowledge. There is a pithy set of bottom lines, which we have distributed, but they're just a teaser. They're an aid memoir, and I encourage you to read the whole thing. I'm delighted that Lord McFall has come to lead the discussion on Paul's book. He's currently Deputy Speaker of the House of Lords, over 30 years of experience as a parliamentarian, MP for the Scottish seat of Dumbarton from 1987 to 2010. Many of us know, recall that he was chair, amongst many other things, chair of the Treasury Select Committee, spanning both the Great Moderation and the not-so-great global financial crisis. In winds fair and foul, Lord McFall held public authorities like the Bank of England to account. He was a leading member of the Parliamentary Commission on Banking Standards, which spanned, of course, both the House and the Lords, and which led to the priorities, legislative priorities and actual priorities for a new financial system. He subsequently served on the Lord's Economic Affairs Committee, where I have and others have faced his questioning until, mercifully, he was appointed Deputy Speaker. But now, and this is right on point for the discussion to which I'm about to hand, he is, amongst other things, reviewing the effectiveness of the Lords committees, the various committees of the House of Lords, so these issues come to point. The plan is that the two of them will have a discussion for around 40 minutes, and then we'll turn to you for questions. We'll have mics. Please identify yourself, if you don't mind, your affiliation. And then when the session's over, having both the teaser in front of you and a bit more substance from the discussion, there'll be an opportunity to buy copies and get them signed. I already got mine at the end of the session. So with that, I'll give you Lord McFall and Sir Paul Tucker. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Governor. I was at a dinner last night and someone asked me if I missed the House of Commons after 10 years as Chairman of the Treasury Committee, and my answer to that was absolutely not. So I am delighted to be here at the Bank of England as a day visitor on that. Paul has already spoken to Parliament. I have a little think tank which I established with David Davis actually at the time, and Lord Sharkey and Andy and others have come along to it. And Paul came along a few weeks ago to give us his views in the book, and we had a very engaging discussion on that. If I could just say that audience for Paul's book is the politicians and the financial regulators. The Governor mentioned that I'm reviewing committees at the moment. One of my colleagues, Lord Rooker, Jeff Rooker, spoke to me the other day in the review and said, John, I was the chair of the Food Standards Agency. When I took up the chair, I asked how many times we'd been to Parliament to be scrutinised, and I was told none. So the Bank of England, Financial Conduct Authority and others maybe get scrutiny, but we have over 70 regulators, and Parliament doesn't do its job. And if there's a big issue in terms of regulators, of the design of the business and the oversight of independent agencies. And I would say that there are huge areas of government policy which have been delegated to technocrats who are insulated from day-to-day politics. And central banks, as Paul said, is now the third pillar of unelected power, along with judiciary and the military. Now, that's perhaps good in one sense, but another sense, if we reflect back on Mervyn King's book, The End of Alchemy, he compared central bankers to be cyclists cycling up a hill, no one behind them pushing them, certainly no politicians. So at the end of the day, somewhere up the hill is going to go pew, and who's going to be there? The politicians, their hands are off that. So there are issues that we have got to talk about here in terms of central banks, regulators and engagement with politicians. In the UK, everyone agrees that the politicians can be voted out, but independent agency regulators can't be voted out. Everyone agrees that something must be done. Nobody trusts politicians. That's very much the case today. So we established arm's-length agencies, but we give the arm's-length agencies multiple vague objectives and a long list of have regard. Now, is that true accountability? Also, the technical regulators usually have a very strong relationship with those that they're regulating. So most of the responses come from the industry, and there's something missing with civic society. And as we know, both regulators and politicians are good at inquiries, but less so at being proactive and giving early warning signals. And when I chaired the Treasury Committee in 2004, one of our reports said, if we don't change this, then we will lurch from crisis to crisis. Alongside the limits of unelected power, there's a need to prompt debate on the processes and resources available for scrutiny from Parliament, and also the public scrutiny and the accountability. Paul mentioned in his speech, and I think it's in his book, that he came to the Treasury Committee a few years ago, and one of the Treasury Committee members, and I can identify him because I'll be quite happy to be identified, and that was my curmudgeonly friend, George Moody. So George was getting a bit fed up, and he said to the Governor and Paul, he said, listen, he says, all we can do is ask simple questions and listen to your erudite explanations. So George went on and asked for examples where the Bank of England changed policy in response to politicians' request. Whereupon the Governor said he could give no such examples because to do so would compromise the Bank of England's independence. So there you are, folks. You know, we ask decent questions and we don't get simple answers. That's where the crux of it is. But unlike it or not, the unelected power is the hallmark of modern society and modern government. So, Bank of England independent, unelected power. Paul, give us your introductory remarks and a response to that, and then we'll have a good discussion.
Well, thank you very much, John. Thank you, Governor, for inviting me to be Speaker of the Bank of England, and thank you very much to Lord McFall for agreeing to interview me. I'm flattered that you're giving up your time. It's very nice to see familiar faces. Those of you that I didn't work with, it's especially good of you to give up your time. But can I just say, it's incredible for me to see David Scholey, Christopher Tugendhat, I'm sure some others, people that go back to when Gordon and Robin were governor, and I'm really, really touched that you should come in this lunchtime. Why did I write? I wrote this book for two reasons that became the same. One was to write down why the modern Bank of England is structured the way it is, with 3 committees, etc., and why we had fended off, especially I, but Mervyn too, had fended off certain powers that people wanted us to have. There was somebody very influential in the Tory party who wanted the Bank of England to be the market regulator, and we basically said no to that, and we would have gone public. We didn't need to. But the broader reason, which was reinforced when I moved to Harvard, was I fear that technocracy is overshot. I mean, you exist in this building because of market failure, but government failure is inevitable too. And the most magical thing, it's wonderful about our system of government, is that it separates how we feel about the government of the day from how we feel about the system of government. So that when a part of government screws up, we in this country, or the United States, Germany, we just vote out the people who have let us, the citizens, down. Except you can't do that with independent agencies. And the more power that is put in the hands of independent agencies, the more alienated I think the people will become, when inevitably government continues to fall down on the job occasionally. Now, so the book is an intervention in the populism versus technocracy debate. I don't see it as a book about central banking especially. It has bits about central banking in there, both because you are now fantastically powerful and because in the last quarter of the book I apply the principles that I develop. And whereas people can contest my knowledge in the first 3 quarters of the book, the stuff that I know about, no one's going to be able to say he really doesn't know about this central banking stuff. People may disagree, but it will be disagreement rather than ignorance on my part. So it's an intervention in the populism versus technocracy debate, but unlike lots of the other books that have been written about that, it's not an attack or celebration of populism, it's a message to technocracy. Had I not had to write the book as a central banker, it's my first book, the subtitle would have been How Technocracy Should Retreat to Preserve Our System of Government and Its Own Contribution to Welfare. You're allowed to have long subtitles as long as you have a punchy title, unelected power. It is very easy for technocrats, and I don't especially mean the Bank of England or the UK, it is very easy for technocrats to acquiesce in being given more and more power. To give an example of that, that's exactly what Howard Davis did at the FSA. More and more functions were given to the FSA. So let me say some crisp things to kind of provoke discussion. One is that I don't think the FCA should be independent. Why do I not think the FCA should be independent? Because it has three equally ranked objectives, each of which is vague, each of which is worthy in their own right. And secondly, because it has one formal decision taker. And therefore, that one person, currently a very good person, is trading off the values of society, the objectives of society. Well, that's why we go to the polls and vote for people. So that's one kind of provocative statement. A second would be, and all the examples are going to be from the UK because it's a UK audience. Something went deeply wrong here when there was a debate about the regulation of the BBC and the role of Ofcom. So the options discussed were this is in the Clementi report, somebody used to work here, a friend of mine. Should the BBC self-regulate? That got knocked out. If it shouldn't self-regulate, should it be regulated by a new independent regulator? That was going to be quite costly for all the obvious reasons. Therefore, it should be regulated by Ofcom, pretty good outfit with a pretty good leader. But no one asked the question, is Ofcom as designed, its structure, not its people, fit for purpose to be so very powerful, to be the regulator of media content and the economics of the media world? Well, France had the same debate 25 or 30 years ago, much richer debate in this country, and concluded it would be a great mistake to have content regulation and the economic regulation in the same building. Whereas that was hardly debated here. And there was no debate at all of, well, if we're going to put it in Ofcom, do we need to look at the structure of Ofcom? Ofcom has a Director General who is the sole policymaker. And I talked to a number of people on the Ofcom board, past but including present, and I said, so are you involved with policy? Yes, they said. I said, did you have a confirmation hearing? No. Do you have votes on decisions? No. Do you testify to Parliament regularly on what you've decided? No. I said, is there a special board for content regulation? Yes, they said. I said, is that created by Parliament? No, they said. I said, does it make binding decisions? No. I then said to a minister, I'm so old I know cabinet ministers these days, I said, so how many decision takers are there at Ofcom? One. Is that the Director General? Yes. What about the chair? Useful for overseeing the stewardship of the institution, but not policy, I said. No. I said, that's one person. Yes. And I thought, how is it? The UK has become casual about power. I say that in the book. How is it that we can make, in a sense, Ofcom is much more powerful than the Bank of England. I mean, this is the regulation of a free press, effectively, the content of the free press, and yet we put it in the same organization as the regulation of the economics of the media, with one decision taker. I mean, that's alien to the traditions of our system of government. Let me give you a third example. This is in competition policy, where the flaw arises in the United States. So, the Sherman Act and the Clayton Act are the definitive statutes for competition policy. One from the Progressive era, one from the New Deal era. Both have objectives that are highly, highly vague. For decades, the antitrust division of the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission applied the doctrines of what was known as the Harvard School, which was essentially, crudely, if A is merging with B and they're going to account for more than X% of a market, then per se it's illegal, and the burden of proof is on the parties to show that it is, that actually it shouldn't be regarded as illegal. And the Chicago School came along in the 60s and 70s and said this is a load of rubbish in terms of economics. What should matter in terms of consumer welfare is whether this merger will bring down prices today or in the future and push up volumes and make people better off. That became doctrine. Some of you that are old enough will remember the great tussle over Robert Bork's nomination to the Supreme Court by President Reagan in the 80s. It became doctrine. It is doctrine in this country. It's doctrine in the EU. The most powerful competition authority in the world is DG Comp in Brussels. It went nowhere near Congress. It didn't really go anywhere near the presidency. The FTC and the DOJ didn't issue a consultative document on it. the Supreme Court just changed, completely changed, high policy. I think that, I don't think that fits with our political values. So what this book is about, it's about trying to fill a gap in constitutionalism. The people, to put it rather grandly, the people that wrote about constitutionalism in the 18th century and before, famously Montesquieu, Madison, John Locke, this wasn't ethereal stuff at 500,000 feet. This was kind of practical stuff about real problems that their societies were confronting. Montesquieu was effectively one of the first political scientists. And they catered for a three-branch state, executive, legislature, and judiciary. Well, now there's all this stuff here and in the regulators. And if you think that isn't a problem, Milton Friedman, when he testified on, I think, the 50th anniversary of the Fed in the early 60s, so it must have been 62 or 63, said to the Senate, should the Federal Reserve be a fourth branch of government? And his question was rhetorical. And I worry that our societies will not reap the benefits of putting certain government functions at arm's length from day-to-day politics unless we are much more principled about how that is designed and explained and debated with the public. And I'll say one more thing, if I may. So this isn't aimed at the Bank of England. Almost it couldn't be, because it's true that Matt and I played fantasy Bank of England, and it is true that the structure you occupy is largely the product of that, which came a bit of a shock to Treasury officials in 2010. But that's, be that as it may. If you look at the States and the debate about whether the Fed, the FOMC, should follow the so-called Taylor rule, Ben and Janet issue robust dismissals in terms of the economics of following the Taylor rule. What they never did is take seriously the trope that John Taylor and people around him always use, which is the rule of law. The reason that John Taylor got traction in the House of Representatives, particularly in parts of the Republican Party, is talking about the rule of law. And unless you take that seriously, you are not taking the argument seriously, because it deploys one conception of the rule of law. That's why there's a chapter about the rule of law. To swing to the other side of American politics, if you like, the Elizabeth Warren left of the Democrat Party, kind of the current progressive part of the Democrat Party, when they complain about the Fed being secretive and captured by Wall Street, or always rescuing their friends in Wall Street, it is equally essential to take seriously the values that they hold around participatory democracy. And unless people in the technocratic center take that seriously, the arguments that are being made about the Fed by the Elizabeth Warren left or the Tea Party right will just pass by in the night. I'll say one final thing, which is when I presented the book in the States, particularly in think tanks in Washington, when you present it in places like Brookings, which kind of right at the center, kind of almost the headquarters of the technocratic elite, the response, except that they know me, is along the lines of, what the hell are you talking about? When you cross the road and go and speak to the Cato Institute, the response is, God, fantastic. How amazing, how staggering that somebody from your world, your former world, wants to talk about the rule of law and democracy. Now, my suggestion is not that those of you in office can go around talking about those things, but legislators need to. Only you in Parliament, in Congress, can make all of this safe. The book finally, in its final sentence, is a plea to legislators and to stand up and represent us.
Good. Thank you, Paul. Participatory democracy, the technocracy should retreat. So how do we get to rebalance the relationship with regulators, politicians, civic society. Any moves on that?
Just shout. It'll probably be picked up on this mic.
Maybe best stand up as well.
Sorry. Thanks very much. Ben Broadbent, Deputy Governor, former colleague of Paul's. I mean, the central thrust of what you said seems absolutely right to me. Well, but I do think that some of the examples you give are more at the egregious end and don't apply universally. And I also think you might overstate the directness of the democracy we have, and also the desirability of that directness. So in the narrow case of the Bank of England, you've got quite a careful structure where we have externals on the MPC, we have one person, one vote. All of us go frequently to the select committees in Parliament. We do not set our own objectives, all of which, by the way, are different from some other central banks like, say, the ECB, for understandable reasons. Equally, when we elect MPs, we elect them for long periods of time, and in principle, we delegate to them as well lots of decisions over which we have no direct say. And I won't, without suggesting which have gone one way or the other, I'd suggest to you that the referendum we had a couple of years ago might be an example of, that seems to clash with the traditions we have in this country as well. So I don't think that although there may be more egregious examples, like the one you gave about Ofcom, either that the delegated authorities are so arm's length that they're unaccountable, or indeed that the elected parliamentarians themselves are simply creatures of the people and will effectively just ciphers for popular decisions on everything. They're not. They're meant to have their own views, and we elect them because we think they're sensible and will take the right views on things. So you may be overstating, the case, I think, to some degree.
Do you want me to respond
Yep.
one by one? So I think you'll like Chapter 8 for what it's worth. I'll infer you haven't got that far yet. So I completely agree it's about double delegation. And actually that gives the problem of commitment a special twist. The book isn't especially about the UK, but I don't think I'm exaggerating about the UK. I mean, here's a puzzle for you afterwards. Name me 3 independent regulators in this country which have a committee structure of the same kind that the Bank of England has. That the model, coming partly out of the new public management fashion of the 1990s, is board, director general, policy powers essentially located in the director general. I broadly agree about the Bank of England, but I kind of wouldn't I? When Mervyn was negotiating with Alan Budd and co. about the design of the MPC, when he was chief economist, I was the head of a division, I wonder whether it still exists, called Monetary Assessment and Strategy, and I was the other person involved in the negotiations. So there are bits of even that design that are me. There's a hell of a lot of the FPC in it, PRA design. But if I can be permitted, I've only got 2 points about the Bank of England that I'll make this morning. I worry from a distance, I don't know how you cure this, that 6 years, 7 years in, all the votes of the FPC and PRA are unanimous. And it's not that from the outside I think it must be easy, it must be disagreement all the time. But I know a little bit about financial stability. It seems to me a bit implausible that there isn't some range of views over that period. But more importantly, this is why I think that matters. The first is just conjecture. The reason it matters is because I don't think it should weigh with the way you conduct the committee. I think it's just a fact I'm going to describe. That one of the things that makes the Treasury Committee hearings with the MPC work is that the minority votes help to focus the debate. oh, King's here, George is there, to pick the earliest example. What is it that they're disagreeing about? And I think those select committee sessions are the single most important part of legitimating an elected power, other than the design of the mandate itself. And I think a challenge that you have here and other regulators have is how to make the hearings with the FPC and the PRA as richly informative for the public and Parliament as the MPC hearings have been over, what now, 20 years. But to end on a positive note on this, John and I, Mark, were talking about this earlier. I mean, there are hearings with all three committees. With many of the regulators in the UK, there are no hearings at all. And let me be clear where I stand on that, both in the book and as a citizen. If there are no hearings, then power should not be insulated from our elected representatives. Something I quote, there was a chair of the Agriculture Committee from, his name, I'm sorry, I've forgotten, about 20 years ago, saying, we've just got too much to do to hold adequate hearings with all the agencies that are formally underneath us, which I think is I don't think that's an outrageous thing to say. I think actually it's a rather professional and transparent thing to say. But if that's the constraint, then reduce the number of independent agencies to a quantity where there can be proper oversight hearings. I'll come back to the George Moody thing later on, perhaps, because it was a fantastic occasion.
And on the question of whether MPs are actually, I mean, as I say, our democracy is not direct anyway.
No, it isn't direct. I think it's very important that it's not direct. I mean, I think that was implicit, Ben, when I talked about the defining feature of our democracy as separating how we feel about the government from how we feel about the system of government. Direct democracy does not do that. Even the Athenian assembly actually had delegated executive powers. What was different about them was was whether or not you went outside your community.
Certainly as chairman of the Treasury Committee at the financial crisis, and even before, I've viewed the Bank of England as a model institution in terms of scrutiny and accountability. Yeah. And I would say, maybe Paul would agree, I think, and Mervyn, if the closest relationship hadn't been maintained between myself and yourselves during that financial crisis, then things could have really gone off, you know. It only took, for example, myself to go on the television and say something, and then it affects it. So it's politicians which are doing their own thing on that. And I was very conscious, as chairman of the committee at that time, to ensure that our committee spoke as one. The things that I was saying, I had to have authentic information on that to make it. And I think
this is a fascinating thing about our committee system, and if I may say so, in particular the way you led the Treasury Committee, which has established a norm that persists. If you look at the congressional oversight of the Fed, both in the House but especially in the Senate, and there are lots of grown-ups in the Senate, you turn up to testify and the senator will read out a very long question and then will probably leave and not stay to listen to the debate after their particular bit. The debate is disjointed and it probably isn't about the subject of the hearing, and it's incredibly hard to produce bipartisan reports. And I think this is because of their incentives. Because they have the committees in the Congress have lots of formal veto powers, essentially, over the course of legislation. That's where the action is for them, not with oversight hearings, other than formal investigations into things that have got horribly wrong. I think that the incentives of members of our select committees are, where the formal powers are very small, is exactly as in the way that you led the committee, to be bipartisan or multi-partisan when you can. And that's incentive compatible because it raises the prestige and the leverage of the members of the committee. And you see that, particularly perhaps on the Labour side, and the number of heavy hitters that are now chairing House of Commons committees, even though they have no formal powers. So I think this has been the most fantastic development in our democracy in my adult lifetime.
And the Bank of England never denied a request for a meeting or a hearing during that time. And I actually mentioned that in public at the last meeting we had.
Yeah.
Any other comments from that? Maybe we'll take a couple of questions if people have them.
So I'm David Beaumersault from the Bank of England. So I've been looking more specifically at the delegation criteria, and I'm wondering whether they may be overly restrictive. So if you think of something like an independent judiciary, I'd find it difficult to see how these criteria could be applied. And sort of coupled with that, I feel there's potential danger that independent authorities become so timid that they would do anything that might be considered sort of political in nature, that they actually don't do much of the good that they could do in their own operations, and effectively become quite inactive.
John?
John Cunliffe, Bank of England. So, as my first two questions, Paul. First question is, we didn't arrive here by accident. So, as one of the people who has been involved when politicians set interest rates and watched that happen, we arrived here because there was good evidence to suggest that independent decision makers made better decisions over time than politicians, and that was econometric evidence over a number of countries. So the first question is, if there is to be more accountability, are we saying that the decision has to be taken by elected representatives, or how do you preserve the benefits that do come from having the decision taken, not just by people who are technocratic, but also have different time horizons and different incentives politicians, because it's not an accident. The second is, every agency that you mention has a piece of legislation. That legislation was put into Parliament by the government, and the reporting arrangements for the agency, whether it has to report to Parliament, whether it has hearings, will be in that legislation. And I think a lot of the issue here is not really about the relationship between the agencies and Parliament, it's about the relationship between the executive and Parliament. And my experience is that there is huge resistance to putting in powers for Parliament when you're drafting legislation. I've done a number of them to create agencies.
Yes.
Because in our system, you are the executive because you control the legislature. We're not the US. Okay? If you don't control Parliament, you stop being the executive. And the executive is quite jealous of its prerogatives. And my guess is that all of those directors general certainly feel they're accountable to their minister, and their minister certainly has a lot of influence on them. So this seems to me more about executive versus Parliament rather than agencies.
So I'm going to start with John, although I think the deeper question is the second one back there. So if it's right that they regard themselves as essentially accountable, beholden to the executive branch, I think that's a fine thing. Certainly discussions with a few cabinet ministers recently would suggest that. I do not mean that. Then that's fine, but it means that the formal position, the de jure position in law, does not match the de facto position. And I think that's a mistake. And it's not just that I think that it's a mistake in a principled sense, you know, I'm kind of where Tucker, rarefied citizen, thinks it's a mistake. I think it's a mistake when things go wrong. Because where is responsibility? Is it with the minister, or is it with the director general? And one of the things the book tries to set out, and it works better, this works better in a parliamentary system, so Canada, UK, Australia, Germany, possibly France, than in the United States, is separate accountability for the design of the regime, which should lie with the executive branch, to Parliament, and accountability for the stewardship of the regime, which should lie with the independent agency. The other thing I would say is, if you take Ofgem, vague objectives, things have changed in the energy world. not least because the kind of price structure's changed. And so what's happened is that the executive branch have pushed through Parliament, well, put through Parliament, because it was easy, almost annual changes to the statutory objective. Well, you know, this bridges to your question, which is you don't get the benefits of credible commitment if you change the objectives every year. So if you put those two things together, if you live in a world where the statutory objectives change every year, and really the Director General is beholden to the Secretary of State, then the principal motivation of insulation from day-to-day politics, which is credible commitment, doesn't hold at all. And, you know, Ofgem, I suspect, is in a bit of a muddle because of all of this. That's certainly the kind of the gossip, which I think I refer to as anecdote in the book. I'm going to touch on the judiciary only very slightly here, because it's a massive question. Should one think about the role of the judiciary in constitutional questions as separate from the role of the high judiciary as the final court of appeal for ordinary law? So should one want a Kelsen court type structure, which exists in many places on the continent, where you have two courts essentially? Or should one want the approach, the structure in the United States and now the UK? And should different, even if you have them in the same body, should different norms apply? There's a fascinating lecture by Tom Bingham. I don't know how many people in the room knew Tom Bingham. He was president of the Judicial Committee of the House of Lords, Master of the Rolls, Chief Justice, and of course chaired the Bingham inquiry into the bank supervision of BCCI. Someone once described him to me as the greatest public servant Britain had had since the Second World War alongside Eddie. Certainly a very impressive man. And the paper is about what are the limits of the common law on judges. What should the norm be, given the ability of the judges to make law? And this matters. In the United States, not here, in the United States, the marginal lawmaker is an unelected judge or an unelected regulator. And a lot of the book is about this. Interest rates are insignificant compared to this. You know, what are regulatory rules? They are legally binding norms that can be enforced with the coercive power of the state. Delegating the power to write laws, known as rules or regulations, is a hell of a thing. The reason for doing so is, of course, exactly as you say, which is as a commitment device. But then you say, should we leave independent agencies free to, I'm going to caricature your question, reinvent themselves as the US cavalry to save the world? When I debate my book, my thoughts in the States with former members of cabinet, the presidential cabinet, on both sides of the aisle, I meet a response from what I call Hamiltonian Democrats, which go along the lines of, in a dire crisis, only the executive can come to the rescue. Actually, it's damn hard for the administration, the elected administration, to come to the rescue. The Fed should do it. The Fed is the cavalry. The Fed should reinvent itself. Everyone will huff and puff, but the court won't strike down its decisions. Congress will puff an awful lot, but the world will move on, and the Federal Reserve will have saved the world. And in some senses, I fundamentally disagree with this, because it assumes, I mean, these are really serious people that hold that view, people and friends and people I enormously respect, and who have been in government and have been there. But I think it treats the world as a one-shot game. And I think there are millions of people in the United States who feel alienated by governance from people they didn't elect. And that's a judgment. I mean, that judgment lies at the very heart of the book, and it may be the wrong judgment. And in a sense, the book is tracing out, if that judgment's broadly right, what does it mean?
Martin Wolf mentions that in his column this morning, Financial Times.
Yeah, he does, yeah.
Antonio.
Thank you. Antonio Ortazorio, Lloyds. Paul, great to see you back. I would like to go to your provocative comments, and can you elaborate a little bit further on what you mean by you thinking the FCA should not be independent? I mean, you mentioned conflicting objectives, and what should be the alternative? I mean, you mean it should be under the Bank of England, or what do you mean? And I would really like to hear John as well on this point. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Hi, it's Simon Nixon, Wall Street Journal and the Times. Paul, I haven't had a chance to read your book yet, but I have just finished reading Jean Monnet's memoirs, and I'm very struck looking at your general principles for independent agencies, at how similar they are to Monnet's ideas for how the higher authority that was going to govern Europe's coal and steel community and other aspects of European affairs should operate. Very, very similar. That sort of leads me to two questions, really. The first is, does your conception of independent agency require national responsibility, or given your own experience sitting on supranational bodies, can an independent agency in the way you're thinking about it work in a supranational level? How does that accountability work? And the second thought is that one of the things that Monnet is very keen on is the idea that the part of the authority or legitimacy of the higher authorities comes through transparency and through the way it communicates its decisions. He's convinced that the general good can be explained if the agencies do their jobs properly. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on the role of the press in this balance of power, or how those powers are exercised. And certainly in my experience, for example, the European Commission, and to be fair, this institution, are incredibly transparent. But other parts of the British state in particular are almost medieval in their aspects of transparency. And I wonder, I'd be interested in your thoughts on on the role of the press in this.
Someone up here. Put my hand up. I thought I saw a hand up there. Yeah.
Alex Mickey, Bank of England. I used to work for Paul on some of the too big to fail stuff. Just following up on the FCA question, your delegation criteria 5 about distributional impact of policies. Of course, extraordinary QE, there were some very thoughtful commentators like Martin Wolf and Adair Turner who were advocating different versions of unconventional QE that would have had vastly different distributional impacts. Does that mean that the Bank of England shouldn't have been responsible for unconventional monetary policy, in your view?
Shall I take these?
Yeah, sure.
So let me start with that one. Monetary policy has distributional effects. QE has kind of pretty obvious distributional effects. When I was got nudged into being open about that and analysing it. And I think 2012 at a hearing at the Treasury Select Committee. I wish we'd got there on our own earlier. But I think it's absolutely vitally important to separate distributional effects from distributional choices. The precept, God, I hope there's not a problem in the appendix, the precept is about don't delegate big distributional choices or big choices about our values as a society. So you hit the zero bound. We, as building, hit the zero bound. The most vanilla thing to do next was to buy government bonds so as to bring down the yield curve and compress risk premium. I held the portfolio balance view of how that would work. We didn't sit around and make a distributional choice. Oh, this will help that part of the room rather than that part of the room. It was aimed at stimulating aggregate demand so as to bring inflation back up towards the target. I think that's a kind of pretty robust view. I think the subtlety, you disagree, and that's where I'm going to go next. I think the subtlety is actually around what counts as a distributional choice. And that I think is, and I do not believe this to be circular, that I think should be part of the public debate when powers are delegated. What is being delegated? What choices are being delegated? We think of things as being distributional now that 50 years ago weren't thought of as being distributional because it was kind of social and cultural blindness in certain respects. And what counts as distributional will change over the next 30 or 40 years. So my package, if you like, requires quite rich debate in Parliament. But this is kind of what they're good at, as long as they're not guillotined. On the FCA, I think the problem, Antonio, is, I mean, it's not with any of the people and it's not with the staff or anything like that. It's with equally ranking objectives, each of which are vague, and with there's no equivalent to the remit that the... So here's the thing. The MPC has lexicographic hierarchical objectives, and the FPC does too. And yet there's an annual remit. Even though they're hierarchical, there's an annual remit from the Chancellor to the Governor that says how you to think about this. That's rather neat. For what it's worth, I can disclose this. The first draft of the first remit for the FPC was a skillful exercise in trying to reverse the order of those, the hierarchical objectives. And I sent a message into Mervyn, and I said, to be aware of this, I'm going to go back on this really fiercely. And, which I then did, and it turned out fine. Now, but that's with hierarchical objectives, the FCA, and the FCA isn't alone in this. The point isn't about the FCA per se, it's just that this audience will be familiar with the FCA. Horizontally ranked objectives, no equivalent of the remit giving guidance as to how they should be traded off. A decision-taking body that comprises one person in law and sets its own budget. I mean, I like the feature of the Bank of England where, I wish it was 7 years rather than 5 years, but this is a kind of inside baseball point where you have to go and get Treasury and parliamentary approval. And I bet this hasn't changed. The Bank of England's a lot more efficient as an organisation than, I can't speak about the FCA, but I was ex officio a director of the FSA, and the solution to everything, and I wouldn't have been different if I'd been the CEO, was let's spend some more money doing X. So I don't think that's a good setup. I don't think it's the fault of the people in the FCA. I think it's a reason for choosing not to serve there. Actually, not the FCA per se, but I wish we lived in societies where people in America would decline to serve in agencies that are too powerful. To Simon's questions, So yeah, I think Monet was thinking about these things from the point at which he was involved with the League of Nations. I think Monet thought about these things really seriously for a long time. I mean, I was involved in a minor way in this institution. He was involved in designing something that's turned out to be enormous. You think about these questions as deeply as you can when you're in that kind of position. I think what you say about international, the book is mainly about national policy making. And I try to say in the preface, I think that I shortchanged the readership on the international stuff, which maybe I'll write more about. I think as it happens for this building and for you, I've just noticed this is the Politburo, isn't it, on the front row. No, it's a fine thing. That's great. Mark is chairman of the FSB, you were chairman of CGFS, I was chair of CPSS, I chaired one of your Mario's working parties, but it was all soft law. And I think the set of issues around international policy making, soft law, where it has to go back to a domestic legal process, where it turns into a legally binding norm only through the constitutional processes of the United States or of the EU, are different from treaty-type organizations. But it's still, you still need to expose that domestically, because given the difficulties, I mean, these international agreements are commitment devices, just as delegating to the Bank of England is a commitment device. And so you don't resile from international agreements lightly. So what's agreed in the Tower is basically going to become policy. That means exposing it domestically to challenge and debate as much as you can. And this is where Parliament is difficult. And Mark has frankly been better at this than Mervyn and I were, partly because you chair the FSB, and partly because you care about it so much. We found it very hard to engage Andrew Tyree in what we were doing. I mean, for an understandable reason. It's not an ad hominem point about Andrew, for goodness sake. We would go along and talk about all the reforms in 2010, 11, 12, and they'd want to talk about the Vickers report and ring fencing. Vickers report and ring fencing. Vickers report and ring fencing, which is quite a useful thing to do, but I don't expect any of you to respond. Is it the most important part of the reforms in this country since the crisis? No, it's not. The most important part of the reforms are the things that were collective. And yet, the reason Andrew and his colleagues were focused on the ring fencing thing is that that was going to go through domestic legislation, and therefore they'd got a stake in that. And drawing with that example at the back of my mind, I say in the book, you just have to, I mean, you do this, but you know, the Fed, the Mario, others, you just have to be very active in talking about what is going on in Basel and how important it is. One point on the EU here. It is a very interesting feature of the EU that all of those soft norms that are agreed in Basel actually go through an EU legislative process that involves the Council of Ministers and the European Parliament, which isn't the case in the United States. And during, you know, when we were working together and doing those things, both Dick Shelby, who was then chairing the Senate Banking Committee, gave a speech attacking Basel, the FSB, in fact, I think. And I thought, how much of that is because under the United States it is done entirely by the regulatory agencies and they don't have to take it back to Congress, and Britain is going to face some interesting choices around this.
One more question. Can we have two? There's sort of members of the press. We don't want to criticise tomorrow. Okay.
Stephen Brown, Bank of England. Lord McFall, you mentioned at the start those pithy questions that you asked at the TSC and sometimes didn't get such a brilliant answer. One of those I recall is a governor who's in charge.
Who's in charge?
And I won't remind you of the answer, but Paul, I wonder, in striving for the democratic legitimacy that at least this paper talks about, and I'm sorry I haven't read the book, is there a risk that with regulators so narrowly focused on such a precise remit, is there an increased risk of underlap such that in fact no one's in charge?
I didn't get a satisfactory answer to that. You know. That's why we're here today.
Phil Aldrich at the Times. I just wanted to turn the issue a bit on its head. Is the lack of elected authority a cause for muting the powers that these legislators or these non-elected policymakers, does it cause them to not use their powers as effectively as they ought to? Now I'm thinking of the FPC when I'm saying this, because obviously the FPC has got LTV, LTI powers, which it has only used in very limited fashion. If you look at South Korea, they've used these powers quite extensively, and other places have used macroprudential tools quite extensively. So if you are feeling that you don't have the elected authority to use them, do you then not use these powers? Is that the other side of this argument?
So let me start with Phil's question and then go to Stephen's. I think your question is a kind of rich one in that I don't know about here, but certainly that can occur. And it seems to me it's kind of a pretty awkward place if any democratic society did find itself in that position where the elected legislature has delegated powers, but people don't actually feel that they should use them because maybe they don't fit there. But actually, it's awkward if they do use them, if they don't actually fit there. Now, my view, and I think we disagree about this, but and my point isn't the substance of the disagreement, it was the lack of debate about it. I thought something that I say this in the book, I think, I thought something that the Bank of England did after I left was very smart, which was you were worried about something going on in the housing market, and you put a cap on the proportion of loan portfolios that can be accounted for by high LTV or high LTI mortgages. That I thought was because it goes to the objective of the resilience of the financial system. I would not be comfortable with the powers that the bank has to set LTV requirements, and indeed, and I shouldn't shy away from that because I wrote an op-ed when I was in office in the FT saying that the Bank of England shouldn't be given those powers. And the reason, the principled reason, is because it's an unnecessary intervention with liberal freedoms. The book is essentially an exercise in grafting Republican values onto liberal values, but the liberal values are still there. And the way of thinking about this is the principle of proportionality, which everyone has now absorbed from the German courts. So, imagine, not in this country, but in some other country, banning the central bank or some, doesn't need to be the central bank, some independent regulator bans interest-only mortgages. But actually there are going to be some people in the country whose personal circumstances are such that it would be completely reasonable for them to take out an interest-only mortgage. And yet, was it necessary to make that ban of interest-only mortgages in order to ensure that the financial system was resilient? Well, no, it can't be, because you could do what Mark and his colleagues did in 2014. Now, the bigger point, other than the kind of techie stuff about financial stability, is that's the kind of debate that democratic societies need to have when they delegate powers. Stephen's point about so one way of thinking about my project is that in the States in particular, the school of thought that you should cabin power carefully is coterminous with the school of thought, particularly on parts of the Republican Party, that the cabin should be small. And that is not the position I hold. The position I hold is that the powers should be carefully delineated and meet the principles that I set out, but that could be quite extensive. I mean, I think the most important thing is that the objective be monitorable, so that you're not just saying, hand over loads of powers, vector of powers P, pursue the public good. Did you do a good job? Yeah, we did. It all worked out fine. And if you think I'm kidding, look at some of the examples in, chapter 15 about the delegation of powers in the United States. When it comes to emergencies, what I think is two things. First of all is, and this affects the ECB a bit, if you need to do something, or you think you need to do something that is within your legal powers, but no one had ever remotely contemplated you doing anything remotely like that, choosing my words carefully, I think you need to go and get some kind of political blessing for it. I think Mario should have gone to, it wouldn't have been easy to do, I think Mario should have gone to the Council of Ministers in intergovernmental mode. I suspect that he did go to Chancellor Merkel, but who knows, before he saved Europe. That's if you're within your legal powers, but you're just doing something that hasn't been remotely contemplated. Then there is, what if you could save the world by going beyond your legal powers? Well, you shouldn't do it. So then what's to happen? And what I recommend is that it should be clear what process the legislature and executive will follow to expand the powers of the agency if necessary. Now, this actually is represented in the new system that you have got after my time, I think, or perhaps just as I was leaving. There's a thing in the MPC remit about that. It's much easier to do that in a parliamentary democracy than an American-style democracy. But what you should not have, and have the American system in mind, is, well, we Congress can't act. We, the executive, don't want to use up any political capital, and we know that the central bank or the regulator will reinvent themselves as the US cavalry, because then you give them incentives always to sit on their hands. Final note. The problem of the only game in town is a very, very nasty strategic interaction between elected politics and delegated technocrats, which is, and it is, if you like, the unpleasant riddle in the middle of my prescriptions. Because I believe your world should have measurable objectives, you are beholden to pursue those objectives. Then when something happens, even if the best response might be fiscal, they can avoid all the political transaction costs of doing the optimal thing, knowing that they can sit on your hands and you will have no choice. And so ultimately this comes back to what do we expect of legislators and what do we expect of the executive branch. And I don't think that anybody in a technocratic agency can take that debate to the politicians, but people like me can.
Paul, can I thank you very much for that? And Governor, thank you for that invitation. I thought there was maybe a little bit of irony when I get invited to your unelected power. Where I am, but it's a privilege for me, so don't worry about that. But could I just mention at the end the review of committees, the hub of this is that regulators, the society and politicians engaging more fruitfully and more determinedly on that. And as Mervyn King said, in an age of radical uncertainty, we don't know what the future is. So Paul, thanks for stimulating that debate, and I think it's a debate that doesn't stop here. We will continue, and we owe you a debt of gratitude for that, particularly yourself, Governor, for this invitation to be here today.
Thank you. And may I just add my thanks to both of you, John, for you skillfully navigating this, Paul, for the contribution here today in the book, and a series of issues that you've raised today that we should take back and reflect on. Now, the no good deed goes unpunished. I think I'd ask that you reflect on some of those issues that you raised towards the end about the international nexus here, because of course we have the intersection of several things. One, it's not just your review of committees, which is timely, it's fundamental, and these are timeless issues that you're raising. Yeah. But of course with Brexit, it's a chance to step back and think about the interaction between democracy, where's power, how it's delegated, how we interact, first point. Secondly, of course, whatever arrangement there is with the European Union, these issues come at that level, supranational levels, that gets mapped down to the democratic and then potentially to ours. And then on the last point, just on the international side, I think realistically it's unlikely, I think you'd agree with this, that that we're going to have new treaty-based organizations for some time to govern the global commons, whether it's economic, capital, environmental. And even those treaty-based ones we have may be subject to a different level of interpretation. So how do we then take some of these principles and build consensus in order to map back to the democratic authorities and the technocratic authorities? What can we draw from the FSB experience? What can we draw? And in those very few spare moments you have, I mean, reflections on that and a broader debate around those, I think, are going to be increasingly essential. So thank you both. Thank you, especially Paul, and thank all of you for your time.
Thank you.
Well done, Paul.